Благодаря за вашето време и внимание. And switching to English, because Greg is practicing his Bulgarian for like a couple of days, but yeah, I think he might need a few more days. So yeah, welcome. I won't take too long, but happy to welcome you guys here visiting, and happy to welcome Greg in Sofia and as a speaker on that small meetup. So handing over immediately.
All right, so thanks for spending your evening here, and thank you to PaySafe for having invited me. This is my first trip to Sofia, and so far it's been a really nice trip. I got in on Sunday from Paris, where I live, and the weather was beautiful, so I went out for a walk. I went to the public park near where I'm staying in an Airbnb, nice apartment, and I heard some music, and I kept walking, and I eventually found an amazing jazz concert going on in the middle of the woods, and I thought, oh, this must be a Bulgarian music, but actually it was Irish music. It was being played by a Slovakian band. So it was like, wow, this is quite a multicultural city, and so I had a good first impression, and I still have a very good impression. So tomorrow when I leave, it won't be the last time I'll be coming back. I think I really like it. I like the experience so far. Let me give you a little bit of content. So tonight we're talking about scaling Scrum. Can you hear me okay? So. You want me to use the microphone? Maybe it would be better?
Yes.
Okay. So this is probably a little bit easier. Is that better? Large-scale Scrum was initially called scaling lean and agile. So the term LeSS is actually new, but the idea of scaling lean and agile is not really new. It began in 2005. I began working with Craig Larman in 2006 when I moved to France. So I live in Paris now, but I'm from Silicon Valley, Bay Area, and I spent 30-some years there developing software, different products, different companies, some that I co-founded, some that I worked at in every different position. And I moved to France after the dot-com balloon popped, and basically it became kind of difficult in the Bay Area. I saw the rebound, but I had kind of had it. I was sort of tired of the Bay Area. I wanted something new. So I came to Europe in 2006, and I don't think I'll go back. I like living in Europe, and I consider myself more of a global citizen. So although I'm from the U.S., I don't, especially these days, I don't relate very much to the U.S. government. So I won't make jokes about Trump, but I have to say I have met him. And it's probably not the one you're thinking of, but a friend of mine in Ireland has a farm. And on the farm he has chickens and cows, and he has a big hog. And the hog is named Trump. And every night this hog gets a big pail of garbage. He gets to eat the garbage. He loves it. And it makes me feel a little bit better, a little closer to home somehow. So anyway, I won't talk any more about politics, but you can kind of understand probably where I'm coming from. So I'm coming from California, and this is a picture of the Bixby Bridge. It bridges together the San Francisco Bay Area with Southern California. They're two different cultures. And the bridge was almost destroyed during fires the summer before last. They burned down to the edge of the bridge there, but it's one of my favorite places, so I like to look at the image. And this is one of my favorite people, my daughter, Sophie. She's now 10, she's going to be 11 in about 2 weeks. And she's my highest priority, so my backlog is very clearly prioritized. Sophie's on the top of that. This was a few years ago. We're at a different beach, not in California, but in the Seychelles Islands. I like being near the water and the mountains. I like to focus on helping people, and so I do coaching and training, and I try to make things simpler. If you think about LeSS, it's really more about descaling rather than scaling. How can you simplify to create an organization where there are fewer roles, more personal accountability, more team accountability, and that's really the secret to scaling with LeSS. It's not by adding roles or taking away accountability. It's by giving more accountability to teams, trusting them, and creating more autonomy. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Just quickly, I started a company, Amelia Services. It's who I work for, and I'm the only employee, so I work for myself. But I work with other coaches and trainers, so I can scale up in a lightweight framework with other people who I trust and want to work with. And I find that works pretty well. I work with a lot of different companies. I'm spending most of my time right now at BMW, working with the people designing and building autonomous driving. So they're building cars that drive autonomously. And I'm also spending time with people doing traditional electrical engineering, as well as the digital department who develops web apps and websites that let you configure your new car. But I've worked in a lot of other industries. I'm not really an expert in car development. Are you asking a question or are you just judging? Okay. Large-scale Scrum you could consider to be an onion. So at the middle are the principles. There are 10 principles, and they are principles such as LeSS Scrum. And maybe some of the people who are in the training that I'm doing at PaySafe will help me. What are some of the other principles of LeSS?
Consumer-centric.
Okay, so customer-centric.
System thinking.
System thinking. Any others?
Lean.
I can be very patient.
Yeah.
We have here.
One of the principles is lean thinking. So do you know about lean already? Although this room is a little bit crowded, it might be a good idea for me to get to know more about you. So to do a social graph is one way to do that. If everybody would stand up for a minute, and it's going to get a little bit crowded in here. If you know, if you've been doing Scrum or Agile methods for at least 5 years, please come towards the center of the room, towards the center where you are over there. If you've been doing it less than 5 years, please go to the back of the room. And if you've been doing it more than 5 years, please do come to the front of the room. If you're more technical and you write code, you wrote some code today, and you write code pretty much every day, I want you to go over to that side of the room. And if you never write code or you almost always do product related or business related stuff, come to this side of the room. If you ever wrote a little code, you can be towards the middle. You can be in the middle of the room. See right now, we see people moving around, giving us information without actually having to talk. So it's visual management, and we see that we have people who are more business over here, more technical over there, more experience with Scrum in the front, and less experience in the back. I think we should stop for a second and thank the people who write code, because if not for them, we would have no work. And we should also thank the people who don't write code, because if they were like me and I'm more over on this side of the room, it would be a worse world if I was writing more code. My code is really not very good. So sometimes it's better to not do things rather than to do them. And that's actually a key to LeSS. What can you take away? What can you remove from the organization to make things simpler? Remove unnecessary processes, unnecessary roles to make things simpler. If you want to sit down again instead of standing up, the only last suggestion would be sit by someone who you don't know very well and say hi to them and ask them just for a minute or two what they do, what they like to do. So go ahead and take a seat wherever you want, but please next to someone you don't know very well. I think that's why Agile works well, is that we communicate. And people who've been in my training know that's what I think. So now everyone knows that. We often don't communicate enough with other people. We walk by each other like we're shadows in the night, and we don't actually know how other people are doing. But we're losing the quality of life by that. So we should actually think about the people that we're with, enjoy the time that we spend, and I'd like this evening to be enjoyable for you. So we'll make this relatively short. We can also have some discussion, questions or comments that you have. So I'll go through a few slides just to give you a general flavor of LeSS. So we have these principles, and one of them is lean thinking. In lean thinking, there are two pillars in the lean thinking house. One is respect for people, and the second one is continuous improvement. Almost everybody knows about removing waste, and this is one of the aspects of continuous improvement. But hardly anybody focuses on the people side, respect for people. And that's, I have respect for you, and I think you respect me. And this is actually a key to improvement. When we start thinking about people rather than just processes or tools. Everybody knows the Agile Manifesto, people and their interactions over processes and tools. So we should always focus on the people who are around us and how we can communicate better. Outside the principles are frameworks. So LeSS has two frameworks, less and less huge. Therefore, the first framework is up to 8 teams. In parentheses, I think it's more like about 5 teams. And when you get more than about 5 teams, even with lots and lots of team member contribution to the product owner's traditional role, you get to the point where the product owner just can't scale anymore. And so you can go to less huge, where you have the product owner and the area product owner. And they still have a single backlog that they share, but it allows you to grow to tens or hundreds of teams. And I've worked with teams that include hundreds of teams. Alcatel-Lucent, the wireless group, had 10,000 engineers and 1,000 system testers in 40 sites. And we used LeSS to help simplify the organization. 200 million lines of code. It was the biggest large-scale Agile development I've done. I've also worked with just 1,200 developers or something smaller. And I found that LeSS works quite well because it simplifies organizations and it gives them a common vocabulary without tying their hands with too many rules and too many procedures. So outside the framework are some rules, and they fit in a page and a half. All the LeSS rules fit in a page and a half. They're just a small number of rules. Then there are guides, and the guides are actually strong advice that will help you in situations to consider options and probably do something that experience shows is a better approach, but not always. And then finally there are the experiments, and the experiments are, if you run into this, try this or avoid that, do an experiment, learn more about it, and then see what you want to do next. As a LeSS trainer and LeSS coach, I like to say what the LeSS founders, Craig Norman and Bess Voda say, which is you should own, not rent, your framework, your way of developing software. Don't buy something off the shelf and rent it and think you can't change it. If you think about buying a house, you can remove a room, you can change the roof, you can do an extension, you can clearly change the color of the house. You own the house. Think about your scaling framework as something that you own and you can change. I like LeSS because it lets you make adaptations. It's not a religious, you have to do it this way or else you go to hell. It's not that kind of a framework. Inside LeSS Sprint, we have several teams working on a common backlog. So here we have a product owner. She has a product backlog, and she offers items to the teams who pull them into their sprint. The sprint might be 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks long, but it's one sprint for the product. At the end of the sprint, we have a potentially shippable product increment. It doesn't mean it's minimally viable product. It may not be sufficiently mature for customers, but it should be able to be safely deployed. It should be able to be inspected. It should be able to be evaluated, so there should be able to be feedback. Instead of having 3 teams producing 3 products, they're all working on the same code base and the same time frame. So there's one sprint for the product, and the teams work within it. The sprint planning meeting has 2 parts. In the first part, the product owner presents items to the teams who select items, ideally in the order of priority. And in the second part of the meeting, the teams break them apart and into tasks, they build a task board, and they proceed in a sprint, primarily independently of the other teams, but there's coordination between teams. It happens naturally. At the end, there's a common meeting, a sprint review, and then each team has a retrospective. After the retrospective, there's a new meeting, and it's the only new meeting in LeSS compared to Scrum, which is an overall retro. In the overall retro, teams bring items that are blocking them, and they escalate them. And management comes and helps remove items, remove blockages for teams. We call this impediment service. It's one of the things that we ask management to do. If you get more than about 5 or 6 teams, you can go to LeSS Huge. And LeSS Huge introduces the area product owner. So here we have a new role. The area product owner is looking at a filtered view of the single product backlog. So we still have only one product backlog, but there might be areas 1, 2, and 3. So if I'm the area product owner for area 1, I will filter the backlog and look at just a subset. Before the sprint planning occurs, I'll meet together with the other area product owners and the product owner, and we will optimize the overall backlog. So the time from an idea, getting into the backlog, and the product coming out is 2 weeks, even at at a very large scale. The cycle time is very short. If you're doing SAFE, you probably know the PI planning happens every 5 sprints, and the teams commit to the next 4 sprints of scope, and the 5th sprint is normally for improvement. So the cycle time difference between SAFE and LeSS is 5x if you're doing 2-week sprints. At the base of SAFE is Scrum. But in SAFE, the product owner and Scrum Master work only at the very lowest level of the organization. And as you go up to the product management level, the program level, or the value stream, or now the big solution level, up to the top level, there are different people involved at each level. From a lean standpoint, this introduces the idea of handoff and delay. So handoff and delay are 2 of the wastes that you want to remove if you're doing continuous improvement. And therefore, it's better to have fewer roles, fewer people, and fewer artifacts. So we keep a single product backlog. We add area product owners only because the product owner can no longer keep up with the requirements of the teams. If we're able to stay with LeSS and not LeSS Huge, it's much preferred. It isn't much more complicated, but a bit more. So now you have also 1 sprint for the product. In the 1, 2, 3 week, 4 week period of the sprint, you go from a new set of requirements to a new potentially shippable product increment. Same cadence, same working agreements. Okay.
You clearly mentioned that the product owner at this scale is not capable to keep track of all the requirements of all backlog items. Yet all the backlog items. Yet there is a product owner who is doing exactly that. It's a little bit of a contradiction.
It's not the inability to keep up with the items, it's the inability to keep up with all the teams and their questions. So the product owner, if you go to LeSS Huge, maintains responsibility for absolute rank order prioritization of this backlog. But
Okay.
they cannot answer the questions of 15 teams at the same time.
Okay.
So they have area product owners who represent them in the sprint planning part 1 meeting. And normally the areas that are defined, in this case we can see 3 areas, they're for 3 customer-centric domain areas. So it might be, let's say, B2C, B2B, and some other channel.
I think I get it, but then it means that the APOs need to have a feedback loop back to the product owner somehow. So
They do.
So-
So every 2 weeks there's a feedback loop. Every product backlog refinement, there's some feedback here. The sprint review, there's feedback as well.
Okay.
So the feedback loops are short. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study in Poland with the payment processor PayU, who I've worked with in a LeSS transition. They decided to do 1 week sprints, and they hacked the framework a little bit. So they added a single overall sprint planning meeting for 15 minutes to see the whole, with the product owner there, all hands meeting, and a single overall sprint review, 15-minute meeting, big picture, where are we? And that was a way to address, I think, even better this idea of cohesive system-level optimization. But it's a good observation. One reason not to go to less huge is you've added some complexity to the system. The simpler, the better.
Could you please explain what is meant by feature team?
A feature team develops features. Features have value for customers. A feature team is usually cross-functional. So let's say architecture development test, maybe UI UX, cross-component. So they're able to work on multiple components to implement a feature. Co-located normally, so sitting where they can see each other's faces during the day. Long-lived, so years together. The team that works closely together on the same item. So some teams are quote-unquote teams because they sit in the same area, but they come into the work and they all do different things. So that's really not teamwork. A feature team should be trying to stop starting and start finishing work. So reduce the work in progress, the WIP, focus on flow, highest value, easiest items first, usually. The product owner needs to prioritize the work, but the feature team needs to interact with the product owner, especially about estimation, questions, getting painful clarity. So, did I answer your question? Any more questions, or should I continue?
So it's kind of a Kanbanized.
It's sort of, yeah. So Kanban, some teams use Kanban within LeSS, some use Scrum, some use Scrumban. They're definitely compatible, and the kind of cadencing across teams that choose one or the other method could be a common cadence for product backlog refinement and retrospectives. Since there may be dependencies between teams, you end up with a kind of a sprint planning need at some point, who's doing what. So you need some way of doing distribution between teams so that dependencies are handled. But the difference between Kanban and Scrum are, the closer you get to it, the less the differences really exist. So let's say that a group of teams are doing support and feature development. You might, using the LeSS approach, have a triage team that identifies whether an incoming change request is urgent and should be addressed immediately, or not urgent and can be addressed in the next sprint. If it's urgent, you could have some teams on call to provide support services for production, and they work in Kanban, minimizing the delay and looking at the different service levels. So use Kanban to support production. And maybe the next sprint, a different team works in Kanban mode, and the team that had then starts working in Scrum mode again with features. So it's an idea of distributing the load of support across a group that does DevOps. Possibly the teams are able to do operational support as well as development. You had a question over there?
So how to take care of dependencies? For example, a team is making some changes that will affect another area.
So Bas Voda, who's the co-author of LeSS, said that there are no dependencies, there are only opportunities for shared code. So that gives you something to think about. We have to be careful that we don't generate dependencies just because they're cool. They're actually not cool. So how do you reduce dependencies, go from gigantic monolithic code bases to microservices, and then it's the code checkout process is less likely to create a conflict or dependency. Automate functional tests, automate integration tests, simplify your code base, refactor it, practice clean code, remove dead code, use McCabe's psychometric complexity ratings to remove unnecessary complexity in code. And after all of that, there still is complexity, there still are dependencies. So teams coordinate directly when there are dependencies that are identified at the sprint planning part 1 meeting. So at this point, you're probably going to see already some dependencies. You might realize that they need further analysis. So after the sprint planning part 1, a group of teams might get together to talk about a strategy for breaking dependencies and how to go about more high velocity development. Sometimes you have a piece of code, it's fragile, it's explosive, and you can't have everybody work on this code, and you have to maintain a component team. So it's perfectly normal that you might have a mix of feature teams and component teams, and over time you try to go to more feature teams, and you might always have some component teams. I've also done a fair amount of large-scale Agile with hardware and software. Does anybody here work in a hardware domain? It's more complicated. No one is saying they are, but if you're doing hardware development like at BMW, they have a 6-year cycle time for a new vehicle. And when the vehicle's in production, they can't actually change the production very easily. It's very expensive. So they're not really at the 3D printing software-based hardware manufacturing stage yet. Maybe that will happen. But there are lots of systems on chips. There's lots of programmable hardware. So we're moving towards more of a software-based world, and even in hardware development. I'm going to go ahead, unless there's other comments. You can look at LeSS Works and find out a lot more about LeSS. This website is probably underutilized. Under the case studies, there are maybe 15 or 20 case studies that are quite detailed about how LeSS has been used in different companies. So I encourage you to read them and to look at the site about particular questions that you might have. I want to play a short video about LeSS.
How are great products created? To develop a great small product, we'd sit together with our team and the customer, give them a new version every few minutes, and work together on the technology to solve their problems. You already know this is the best way to develop small products. But what usually happens with large product development? Typically, we get boring specifications from an internal department, then hand over our work to another internal department. We interact with managers instead of real customers, don't have much say in the process, don't have much effect on the whole product, and lack a sense of purpose. We might even believe we're doing Scrum or some other agile methods, but our organization's inability to learn and adapt to reality will bite us sooner or later. What was better about small-scale development? Our approach was customer-centric. We saw the whole product at once. We had minimal process, and we had effective reality checks about the product and our way of working. It was natural. Is it possible to take what works so naturally in small-scale development and apply it to large-scale development? This question has driven Craig Larman and Bas Vare for over a decade. It's led to hundreds of experiments and the formulation of LeSS. LeSS is a simple framework for scaling agile development using these principles and some others. LeSS has been used with groups of 12 people, hundreds of people, and thousands of people on products from banking to telecom, games to radar systems. How does LeSS work? LeSS is multi-team Scrum. There's one product owner providing vision and one adjustable prioritized list of customer-centric items, the product backlog. We want one integrated shippable product increment every sprint, every 1 to 4 weeks. Multiple teams develop this product one shared sprint at a time. Development is iterative and incremental. Each sprint starts with Sprint Planning 1, a short shared event where each team selects features from the top of the product backlog that they will implement during the sprint. That's followed by Sprint Planning 2, where the teams discuss their strategies for developing their features. During the sprint, each self-managing team develops the features they selected while collaborating and continuously integrating with the other teams on the potentially shippable product increment. Coordination outside the team is now a team responsibility, so there are no assigned coordinators. Halfway through the sprint, teams briefly pause the current sprint work for product backlog refinement, collaboration with customers and end users to clarify work for future sprints. By connecting teams to customers, we free up the product owner for vision and prioritization. We have one sprint review, a shared session where teams and customers explore what was done and determine the best next increment to develop. Each team retrospects to inspect and adapt its own way of working. We want teams to own their methods and processes, not rent them. Without ownership, there can be no continuous improvement. And in LeSS, we don't stop with the team retrospectives. Teams, product owner, Scrum masters, and management use the overall retrospective to explore the systemic and organizational obstacles that prevent higher value delivery. Use LeSS to inspect and adapt the entire organization. Then, they repeat the whole cycle, experimenting and making wiser mistakes each time. When we have more than 8 teams, we do something similar called LeSS Huge, still targeting one shippable product every sprint. So that's the LeSS framework, just a few rules you can learn in a few minutes. But it won't work in your organization. Not the way your organization is now. Your organization would have to change into one that allows it to work. This isn't quick or easy. You and your organization are currently designed to resist, undermine, and neutralize any steps toward real agility. The few rules that LeSS has are impactful, with far-reaching implications. Adopting LeSS can take years of stripping away the existing organizational rules, processes, structure, and habits. LeSS adoptions aren't just process changes or roles added to your existing organizational structure. You've already seen agile labels applied to existing habits with no real change. LeSS adoptions go deeper, challenging conventional wisdom about projects, products, roles, technical practices, and management practices. We allow agility to work by changing structure and policy. For example, the teams must be cross-functional, which means they don't only code and test. They also include software design, architecture skills, business domain knowledge, and UX/UI design skills. The teams are responsible for requirements clarification with the customers and end users. The teams also must be feature teams, which means they can develop end customer-centric features, not just internal components. LeSS teams span components and work in a shared code environment. Organizations often try to solve immediate problems by adding complexity. For example, let's say our product crashed in production because a team neglected to run a test. My first reflexes as a manager would be to impose prescriptive process steps on the teams, assign someone to a new specialized role, or form a new department to prevent this error in the future. But all 3 of these quick fixes can exacerbate the underlying problems by reducing team responsibility. Giving responsibilities to processes, specialized roles, or other departments takes responsibilities away from the team. Companies wind up with employees who are just mindless zombies. We believe in removing that complexity instead. More with less. More with less also discourages things like handoffs, preparation sprints, stabilization sprints, so-called dependencies, separate analysis groups, separate architects, and separate queues for each team. In LeSS, Scrum Masters and management help the teams learn. Management shifts focus from direct command to improving the capability of the development system. In our experience, the LeSS framework is the minimum, barely sufficient structure that product groups need to take ownership, gain a whole product view, and optimize organizations for value delivery and flexibility. You can learn about the experimental mindset and also over 500 experiments that help inform the framework, guides with strong recommendations about how to apply it, and more about the 10 principles we touched on. There's also us, a growing community of practitioners and coaches. We invite you to move away from life-sucking industrial-age machine organizations toward human, purposeful organizations where work can be fun. It won't be easy, quick, or painless. But if you work at it, you can simplify your organization, increase your adaptability to changing business conditions, remove unnecessary drudgery, and unleash the potential your organization had all along.
So I'm going to show you just a little bit more about LeSS. If I can find the cursor here. There we go. And comparing LeSS to SAFE. Comparing LeSS to SAFE, sorry. I'd like to get rid of this microphone, but I'm not doing it. There's a guy, Etienne, who compared, he has a company, Digital Tango, and he looked at the flexibility and the level of coverage or the completeness of different frameworks. And there's Scrum of Scrum in 2001 that's really not very complete. And then Scrum at Scale is a newer technique, more flexible, well, not as flexible as Scrum of Scrum, but somewhat flexible and somewhat more complete. Nexus, Spotify. Spotify isn't really a framework. If you talk to Henrik Nieberg, he quite clearly states that there isn't a Spotify method. They keep changing the way they work at Spotify, but there still is a fair amount of content about how Spotify organized their agile scaling, and there are a lot of good ideas there. So some people talk about the Spotify model. Is anybody here using the Spotify model? Is anybody using SAFE? It's okay, we won't shoot you. Anybody using LeSS already? Anybody using Scrum at Scale? How about Nexus? So it seems like most people are not using any scaling framework currently. Is that true? If you're not using any scaling framework, can you raise your hand? So the majority are not using any scaling framework.
Can we say we're using some kind of scaling and not a framework? I mean,
Yes, you could. So you're scaling, but you're not using a framework. That was my question.
we're trying to find our way how to scale.
We're all trying to find our way. You could actually refer to a framework and not follow it, but know it. So knowing different frameworks is useful. It's like planning is useful. The plan itself is useless. So you want to be able to think about the different options and then do things that work for you. So at the top here we have SAFE, which is more complete but very prescriptive. And you have to follow an exact checklist of everything that you do at every step. And if you want to change the training material, you cannot. If you want to translate it, you cannot. Or you violate the agreement with the Scaled Academy. It's an extremely controlling organization. It has 35 salespeople worldwide. The LeSS company has 0. So there's a difference commercially in the two frameworks. But SAFE does have a portfolio level, and that's what you can see at the top. DAD, does anyone know Disciplined Agile Delivery? So are you using it, or you just read about it?
No, just no.
Okay. So Scott Ambler is the person who wrote about DAD. Scott Ambler is well known in the Agile community. He worked at IBM for many years as their Agile fellow, and he knows a lot about Star Trek. I had him on a panel discussion in India. I gave a lunchtime talk about Agile, and he was on the panel. And every time I asked a question, he said, that reminds me of the Star Trek episode. And he started talking about the Klingons. And, people really laughed a lot, but he didn't say anything actually at all about scaling, which was a little disappointing to me. If you use LeSS with innovation games, which is what I like to do, I think that it's actually extremely flexible and also comprehensive. So I don't give up the battle about comprehensiveness to SAFE just because they have a portfolio level. I've spent 17 years in financial software development. I know a lot about portfolio management, and I think it's not difficult to do portfolio management with LeSS. So if you feel like that's a problem, we can talk more about it. These are the principles. I won't go into them in detail. This whole product focus and customer-centric aspect are very important to me. So are systems thinking and lean thinking. Systems thinking helps you to have conversations with people who are in disagreement. about an issue, to get unstuck, and to start thinking about what is the overall system that we're talking about, what are the system dynamics, and how might we work together to get the desired outcome. So if you take a training as many of the people in here are having, we did a causal loop diagram exercise about global warming, to try to understand how does global warming work, and what might you do to control it. Lean thinking, continuous improvement are important principles also. Innovation games, as I mentioned, I think they help scale less to the portfolio level, to an enterprise level. How many people know Speedboat already, are using Speedboat as a technique? So it's quite useful for determining what's holding us back from getting to where we want to go. And then you have a product box exercise, an innovation game to identify what is your product, how do you touch it, how do you feel it. I used this recently with BMW around their design UI UX group. What is their product? How do they represent it? In LeSS, we try to identify what is the product before we define the organizational structure. We want to have a product-centric organizational structure that is complete and sufficient to build a product. There's one product owner in charge of a product, and they may have area product owners if you have more than 5, 6, 7, 8 teams. This is about a game called Buy a Feature. Has anybody used Buy a Feature before? Some people know that. I'm also an innovation games instructor, so I know a lot about them and I use them a lot. What you probably don't know, this is a little fun fact, is Craig Larman, the author of LeSS, used to work for Luke Holman, who's the creator of Innovation Games. And the two of them have gone in different directions. They both are well known in the Agile community. I've had the pleasure of working with them both quite a bit. And I've seen many times that the two of them, although they don't, for about 20 years they didn't communicate, their ideas are quite compatible, and if you combine them together, you get a very powerful mixture. So, in particular around customer centrism and innovation. Prune the product tree is a great way to see what can you take out of your product and still deliver the value that you're trying to deliver. And then there are other games that I think are quite useful. Innovation Ambition helps you identify the target portfolio of features by 3 categories. Which features are serving your core market and your core technology? Which features move you into a new market and maybe some new technologies? And which features are totally innovative for you? Totally new market, totally new technology stack. And it helps you look at what are the proportions in each of these different categories. A healthy company has a reasonable mix in those 3 categories. An unhealthy company might be doing nothing but taking risks in danger of failing, or doing nothing but taking care of their old customers with their old features and not growing. And they would die a slow death. So it's good to look at your portfolio of features and analyze them for innovation and compare them to how innovative you want to be. Innovation games help your groups make better decisions, and this is a way of thinking about, start with ideation, idea generation. You shape the ideas into something that fits your target market, you prioritize them, and you end up with a coherent single product backlog. I use innovation games to help companies do road mapping, to identify a roadmap that is targeted at certain segments and which will deliver value to those segments in a sequential manner, so that each small release gives you incrementally more market share or more in-depth market satisfaction. So you can look at a company. Luke Holman created this company, Contenio, and I also teach LeSS innovation games. But you can look at this website, and it gives you a lot of ideas. They can be done in person, or they can be done online. And this is a little sheet that I used to propose a topic at a product camp, and I think because of the use of colors and images, it was like one of the most well-attended sessions. And we're going to do this for the people who are in the LeSS training here at PaySafe tomorrow. I'm going to go through product roadmapping using innovation games. I'll skip over that. A little bit about roles. To help scale in LeSS, we ask the product owner to delegate more to the team, to trust the team, to directly interact with customers, to understand what they need, to be empathetic. And we ask the product owner to delegate clarification for that reason. But we don't delegate prioritization. The product owner prioritizes the backlog items for the team, but the team may talk directly to customers about what they need. That helps one product owner scale to multiple teams. If you want things to go fast, keep the requirements short, testable, and have them be developed by the developers. Developers can write requirements. They tend to be very efficient. They're focused on how it will actually calculate things, how it will actually work. If you want to write a novel, don't write requirements. Go into publishing and write a novel. Sell to people who want to read a novel, but don't sell it to developers. They don't want to read a novel. In LeSS, we have a sprint planning, sprint review, we have retrospectives, we have product backlog refinement. In the sprint planning meeting, the product owner starts in the sprint planning part 1, and she represents the items in her backlog that are important for the team. Teams pull the items into their own sprint backlogs. Every team has a sprint backlog. They work for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, however long the sprint is, and at the end they show the results in the sprint review. In the sprint review, the product owner sees the results of the work. We encourage the product owner to get feedback early, as soon as features are done, to talk to the team, for the team to share the item, and to get some feedback before the sprint review. But at least every 2 weeks, the product owner will see what the teams have worked on. Then the teams will talk amongst themselves, how can we get better? What are the problems we're having? What experiments would allow us to improve? We add this one meeting, the joint retrospective or overall retrospective, so that people can escalate issues that they can't solve at the team level, and overall the teams will work together with stakeholders to remove impediments. And I told people in the training about a case at a BWIN party in Vienna where the impediment was a broken printer. They eventually took the printer and put it in the hallway on the way to the conference rooms, which made it very visible. So until the printer was fixed, people could not go to conference rooms. You don't have to go to these extreme measures, but you do need to make visible impediments. A good way to do it is if you have a head of R&D or you have a COO, on their door put a Kanban, so when they come to the office in the morning and they go home at night, they can see the issues that have been escalated. And then encourage team members to escalate items, but not anonymously, with identification. So if you want to escalate an item to the CEO, don't say that you don't know how to tie your shoes and you want him to do it for you. It's kind of absurd. It should be an item that you really need help with. So don't abuse this escalation process. There are some different techniques for doing the overall retrospective. One that I really like is called circles and soup. And does anybody know circles and soup? I know some people do because we talked about it today. Maybe somebody who learned about it can explain it to the other people. So it's really helpful for people who are frustrated that items they can't do anything about, they can make them visible, and the managers come to help the teams. Then you make it visible what the managers are doing. If they're not helping the teams, you could put pressure on them. Not unfair pressure, reasonable pressure. If your job is to manage a group of people and they're having trouble, you should probably do something about it. If you're not, what are you actually doing? We had a little sticker today in the training, which is, I do nothing. And it was kind of a joke. This is the role of management, is to do nothing. Is anybody here a manager?
Absolutely. That's my response.
Some people say, and Jürgen Appelwell, who I really like quite a bit, wrote a tweet and he said, "It seems like SAFe is the only framework that does not hate managers." And when I read this tweet, it was like, oh, that's painful. I've been a manager. I've been a manager quite a bit of my life. I don't hate managers. Does that mean that I must now embrace SAFe so that I can't hate managers? One of the things I have to apologize about is I don't think Les has done a good job of describing the role of management, well-intended, agile management, who are appreciated and respected by their teams. There is definitely an important role for management, and it's not just cleaning up the garbage or washing the dishes. It can actually be inspiring people, hiring the right people, motivating them, or having ideas. Just because you're in management doesn't mean you have stopped having ideas. And I think this is one of the problems I've seen now at BMW. They hire a lot of PhDs, top of their field. They pay very well. They hire the cream of the crop. And these people eventually get promoted into management. So should they stop thinking of ideas? These people a lot of them are geniuses. They have great ideas. They should keep thinking of them, these ideas, right? So how do they integrate them into teams? This is an important challenge for the Agile community. We should not hate managers. We should figure out how to work better with them collaboratively to come up with better ideas together. Maybe one solution is just take off your manager hat and just work with the team collaboratively. One of the issues, though, is that teams don't trust managers usually. They can fire them, they can give them a promotion, or they can give them a demotion, they can give them a raise, or not. I had somebody say in our training today that in Eastern Europe, people don't actually care about money, they don't actually care about promotions. Maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration.
What's that?
I'm not going to say it. It's someone I respect quite a bit, and it's a bit of an exaggeration. But do you care about money? So some of you do care about money. Will you do anything for money? No. So it's not a contradiction. You can want to be paid reasonably well, and also have standards, moral standards about how you want to work. So I don't know. It's an important consideration in what affects people and what motivates them. In coordination, there is an important technique that is not very well utilized. So I want to show you the technique and see if you're surprised.
Wow.
It works amazingly well. It's kind of a closely held secret. I mean, you could send an email or an SMS or a Slack message, or you could just talk. And it actually works really well, so you should try it sometime. I'm sure everybody does do it. That's why I wanted to start with a little conversation today, and we're soon going to go to more conversation. Talking is a great way to communicate and deal with coordination. It doesn't have to be a complex board with red strings showing how everything is connected together. Communities of practice are also a great way to coordinate. So now that you move from, let's say you move from component teams to feature teams, what about the technical quality related to components? How do you manage this? The community of practice is one way to do that. You know what communities of practice are already?
I have.
Everybody?
I have a question about communities of practice. How do you motivate people to have them? I mean, how do you promote such communities?
You pay them. You pay them extra money.
It happens, for example, 1 or 2 meetings that are, I don't know, people just gather together and after that it dies. At least in our experience.
Yeah, some communities of practice don't live forever, and some are very vibrant. So it depends probably on the company environment. Sometimes you need a distinct policy like Google has, the 20% rule. So the Google 20% rule, everybody knows that rule probably. 20% of your time you get to spend on a topic of your own interest. If you actually have time to pursue an interest, you're more likely to be motivated in a community of practice. If you don't really have time to do anything in the community of practice, and you have so much pressure to finish your other work, it might seem like a waste of time because you need to get busy and keep working on whatever else you were working on before. So it's related to continuous improvement, investing in learning, how well is your company or your environment supporting learning new things. It's also having to do with how well led is the community of practice. So a piece of advice is, when you have communities of practice, find a good leader, either through self-selection or appointment, and make sure that the content is useful. That people are not just coming to hear a talk, but they're discussing items and then investing time and money into exploring items. A community practice can be a great R&D environment, for example. How many people have done an open space before? So maybe 15 or 20%. Open space is a great way to coordinate with large groups of people in a self-organizing way. Open space has been around for quite some time. You might consider, this is a regular meetup that we're having tonight, I think. You might consider doing an open space for one of your next sessions. Have you done it already? Okay. So maybe some people here just haven't been to as many sessions, so they maybe didn't raise their hand. I won't go into more detail about it, but in LeSS we use open space frequently also at retrospectives, to try to help people identify what's most important to them. Craftsmanship is an important topic. Is software craftsmanship a big deal in Sofia or not? Do you have a movement around software craftsmanship? No? It may arrive soon. It's relatively recent in the US and in France. The craftsmanship movement there is probably 2 or 3 years old. And it's basically kind of resurgence of XP, extreme programming, and the idea of the software developer as an artisan who is proud of their work and does it well and becomes a master craftsman. And so it's a kind of a counterbalance to get more features implemented faster by the product owner. It's more do your work well in a way that you're proud of it. I could add clean code here as a topic. How many are doing continuous delivery? And how about continuous integration? It's been around longer. Who's doing continuous integration? Can anybody define continuous integration for me? What is continuous integration? I'll just pass the microphone and keep passing it until somebody answers the question.
It's a practice of continuously integrating everyone's code. It could be done every minute, every hour.
Who does the practice?
The developers.
Perfect.
It's extreme programming practice.
Yes. That was a great response. So that's from Nicolas. A continuous integration server. So we're doing continuous integration. And then you find out that developers have checked out code and it's been checked out for 2 or 3 days. Or they talk about the nightly build. Nightly is not continuous. It's like once a day. So understanding the importance of this will help you scale. If you have that many different versions of code and you now have 1,000 developers, the nightmare of integration will kill you. If you do continuous integration at scale, although it's a discipline, the discipline is very useful for reducing conflicts, reducing contention and dependencies. We got into this issue earlier about dependency management. It's a good way to reduce dependencies and do continuous integration. Unless there are a few different relationships, I'm going to go through the rest of these pretty quickly. Who has questions, just so I can get an idea of the volume of questions you might have in general? All right. So I'll leave some time for questions. And who's thirsty and wants to have a beer? Let's stop for a minute and have a beer break because I cheated during the video. I went and got a beer.